Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim, here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I am doing fantastic. How are you today, Tim? How's everything going? How's life?
You know, it's fine. It's good, actually. I cannot complain. I'll take your line. I can't complain, Lance. I'm especially happy that we have on our friend and colleague on this episode. His name is Robin Warder, and we discuss his podcast a little bit, The Trail Went Cold, but specifically one moment. Actually, I'll just go ahead and call it the tweet heard round the true crime sphere. It was written by Robin from his The Trail Went Cold podcast account at Robin_Warder. Do you want to read it, Lance?
Sure. The tweet reads, "Yesterday, this man was indicted for the 1984 murder of 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews, so it's horrifying to see that he's one of my Patreon supporters. He's a patron for a couple of true crime podcasts, but I'm the only one who covered Jonelle Matthews' case, so yikes." And below that is a picture of former gubernatorial candidate from Idaho, Steve Pankey.
Yeah, I remember seeing this and then reaching out to Robin to, ask how he was doing, because I would imagine this would shake him, and I would think this would if we were in this position.
Absolutely. It's quite a reality check, as we discuss with Robin in this interview. The responsibility that he took upon himself to even put that out there was more like a public service announcement and a reminder, like I said, a reality check for anybody who's doing true crime podcasting. You're talking about real crimes with real people and real criminals and real victims. And sometimes those families of victims listen to these true crime podcasts. The one thing that never really settled in, or I personally had never really come to terms with, was that the criminals might actually listen to these podcasts. Never really thought about that on a serious level. They do, and sometimes they contribute to them too.
Yeah, I think you're right, Lance. They do, and I think that is kind of something that maybe we've blocked a little bit, or don't want to face head on. Some of us creators, but really us as well. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation with Robin, kind of discussing that and how prevalent that could be in this true crime landscape that we work in, Lance.
And to be clear, Stephen Pankey was arrested, but he has not yet been convicted of the murder of Jonelle Matthews. He did volunteer DNA to police in order to prove his innocence.
That's right, and the crime is the murder of 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews. She was 12 in 1984 when she went missing from her house in a neighborhood. And then just earlier this year, almost 25 years after she had last been seen, her body was found at an oil and gas site not too far from where she lived. All right, I hope you enjoy this conversation and check out Robin's show, The Trail Went Cold. Thanks a lot for listening. Oh, and stay tuned for our true crime riddle game at the end of this episode. Welcome to the podcast, Robin Warder. How are you today, Robin?
Very good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great.
Can't complain. Thank you so much for joining us. How busy are you? Has everything just picked up for you? I feel like you got a lot going on right now.
Well, I even though I'm a podcaster, I still work a full-time job, but thankfully I'm currently working from home, so I can balance doing that and working on the podcast and do this interview at the same time.
Well, great. Your podcast, The Trail Went Cold, is excellent, and I imagine the new Netflix releases of Unsolved Mysteries have kept you extra busy, too.
Oh, definitely. I still remember when the original came out in July, and I was getting all these requests to cover the cases that were featured on there. I've already done an episode of the Ray Rivera case, and in a couple of weeks, I'm releasing an episode about the Patrice Endres case, which was on the first season, and now I'm already planning to do episodes on some of the ones that just came out on the second season.
Great. And can you explain the premise of your podcast, The Trail Went Cold?
Okay, well, it's been around nearly 5 years now. It started in February of 2016. It is a weekly podcast that covers a different cold case on every single episode. And the format is that the first half of the episode, I talk about the facts of the case, what happened. And then the second half, I talk about potential theories and analysis about what might have taken place. And, of course, I feature a lot of cases that were featured on Unsolved Mysteries.
And what was it about Unsolved Mysteries that really drew you in? I mean, it's a pretty obvious answer, I guess, but you were obviously a fan of it when you were younger, the original series with Robert Stack. Is that sort of the genesis of it, or was it just the appeal of it that you keep going back to years ago when you were younger, watching this and being just enthralled by the mystery of the whole thing?
Yes, I always credit it as bringing up my interest in true crime because I originally watched it in the late 80s when it was on TV, and other than America's Most Wanted and a few other shows, that's pretty much all we had to whet our appetite for true crime. It's not like today. And I always had an interest in the show, and I always went to a message board to discuss theories about the cases that were still unsolved. And at the time I started this podcast in early 2016, you could not watch the show anywhere. It seemed like whenever anyone tried to upload the old episodes onto YouTube, they would immediately get taken down for copyright reasons. But about a year after I started the podcast, a company called FilmRise acquired the digital distribution rights and released them on Amazon Prime and eventually YouTube. And nowadays, anyone can watch the old episodes. They have all the seasons available at your disposal. And I think that's only increased interest in the podcast because people will watch a segment about an unsolved case, look for more information online, and then they'll come up with the Trail Went Cold episode about it because I often go more in depth into these cases and reveal information that were not mentioned on the original TV episode.
What were some of your early ones before we get into the meat of our discussion? What were some of the earlier ones that stayed with you that you decided those would be the ones you covered a little bit more in depth on the podcast, like as you were planning your podcast?
Well, if you go online now, the very first Robert Stack hosted episode available, it features a story about a woman named Aileen Conway, a housewife from Oklahoma who died in a mysterious car crash. And at first they wrote it off as just a simple accident, but there were just so many details about the case which made no sense because when her husband returned home that day, he found like the bathtub had been left full, the garden hose was running, the iron was left on, and the spot where her car crashed was on a remote country road which she had never traveled to before. There was no reason for her to be there. So he suspected that she had been abducted and become a victim of foul play, but they never found any evidence to lean in either direction. And to this day, over 30 years later, we're still no closer to solving it and figuring out what happened. So that's why I decided to make it the subject of the very first episode of The Trail Went Cold.
Recently, you had kind of a really startling revelation on Twitter. On October 14th, you tweeted, "Yesterday, this man was indicted for the 1984 murder of 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews. So it's horrifying to see that he is one of my Patreon supporters. He's been a patron for a couple of true crime podcasts, but I'm the only one who covered the Jonelle Matthews case. So yikes." And then you have a picture of Steve Pankey smiling and had joined your Patreon or May of 2019. So, yeah, can you take us through this?
Okay, well, the Jonelle Matthews case I covered on the podcast in January of 2017. It was actually a request from a listener named Steve W., and a lot of people have asked me if it was actually Steve Pankey who requested it, but I just want to clarify right now that no, it's an entirely different Steve who I'm talked to personally on Facebook, so it's just an odd coincidence. So no, he did not actually request I cover the case on the podcast, but this other Steve had an interest in it because it involves a 12-year-old girl named Jonelle Matthews who went missing on December the 20th, 1984 in Greeley, Colorado. She had spent the night at a Christmas concert and was dropped off at home by one of her friends and her friend's father. And at the time, her mother was out of town, and her father and her older sister were at a high school basketball game that the sister was playing in. So for about an hour, Jonelle was alone at her house. She was dropped off at around 8:30 p.m., and then when her father and sister returned home at around 9:30, they discovered she was not there. But her shoes had been left behind, she had left a portable heater on, and there were footprints in the snow outside the house, so the evidence strongly suggested that she had been abducted by an unknown intruder. At the time that I originally recorded that episode, there were no real strong suspects, at least none that were named publicly, so all I really knew for sure is that she was abducted by an unknown party and likely murdered, but we had no idea who. At the time Steve Pankey originally joined on Patreon, it was May of 2009, but at the time he had not yet been named as a person of interest, so I did not put two and two together. I had no idea he was affiliated with this case. But then in July of 2019, they were doing an excavation project in a remote area just outside of Greeley to install an oil pipeline, I think it was, and they wound up accidentally coming across some human remains, and they soon did DNA testing to positively identify the remains as belonging to Jonelle Matthews. And shortly thereafter, they wound up naming Steve Pankey as a person of interest. By this point, he had long moved out of Colorado, he had moved to Idaho, and even made some failed attempts to run for governor on two separate occasions prior to this, so he was kind of a public figure there. And once he was publicly named, he started doing a number of interviews defending his innocence, saying that the Greeley Police Department had it in for him and that they were trying to frame him for this girl's murder. And at the time, I didn't put two and two together because he had signed up for Patreon in May before he was named as a person of interest. So I just did the standard thing where I send my patrons stickers and a card thanking them for their support, but it wasn't until recently when I was going through my list of patrons that I noticed that Steve Pankey's name was there, and I double-checked, and because his photo was there and he had done interviews on the news, I was able to verify that he was the same guy. And what was crazy is that he signed up for my top level tier, meaning that he was pledging $10 per month. So to get all the bonus rewards. So I always wondered, did he join? Did he find the podcast because he was looking for an episode about Jonelle Matthews? But if that was the case, he must have legitimately liked it if he's willing to sign up for the top tier reward system and send me $10 a month. So it kind of shook me up. But it turns out that he has signed up for a couple of other podcasts on Patreon, like Already Gone, The Vanished, and Traced Evidence. But the key difference is that my podcast is the one that covered the Jonelle Matthews case. So that pretty much shook me up when I found out.
Yeah, and I'm sure he was covering. I would bet that he learned of your show because you covered it. I mean, that seems pretty obvious, even though the other ones didn't necessarily cover it as well. Maybe your coverage introduced him to true crime podcasts. Maybe he sent requests to them. I guess we don't know.
Well, it's crazy because when I did the episode back in 2017, I never mentioned his name because he had not been named yet as a person of interest. But in the first of this year, on New Year's Day 2020, I actually released a special update episode where I went over cases that I'd covered on The Trail Went Cold that had either been solved or had major developments. And I talked a little bit about Jonelle Matthews, how her remains had been found, and that Steve Pankey had been named as a person of interest. But at that time, I had not yet put two and two together and realized that Steve Pankey was one of my patrons. So he did hear a podcast episode where I mentioned his name earlier this year. So that kind of threw me for a loop.
It's pretty incredible. Do you think he might be responsible for other crimes as well? Because this one, I don't want to get the victim lost in the amazingness of him connecting with you, because that's an amazing story that he connected with you, but the crime that he committed is atrocious. Do you think that he's responsible for other crimes? Is that why he's listening to other true crime podcasts?
They've never proven that yet, but it would not surprise me. I've been reading that he worked as a youth minister, and he went to the same church as the Matthews family and lived, I think, about 2 miles away from them. But as far as I can tell, they never personally knew each other, but it's possible that he had his eye on Jonelle because he apparently had a reputation throughout the area at staring at the children. But at this moment, it's kind of creepy. And we don't know the details yet because this hasn't gone to trial. But I have always wondered how he could have known that Jonelle was going to be alone on that particular night. They found out when the neighbor or the friend of Jonelle dropped her off at 8:30 that night. They noticed that the garage door was open, but no one could be sure at that point whether the family had left it open earlier that day or if the intruder who took her wound up opening it. So I've always wondering, was he in the house waiting for her when she arrived home? One other piece of evidence is that after Jonelle arrived home, a substitute teacher from the school where Jonelle's father worked as a principal actually phoned the house and talked to Jonelle to leave a message, and Jonelle wrote it down on a notepad. So that's how they were able to establish that she was at home for maybe at least 10, 15, 20 minutes after she was dropped off, and then after she took the message, she was abducted. So I'm really curious to know if Pankey was there already, or if he was watching the house and decided, well, she's home alone tonight, now is my opportunity.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to learn more when more case details come out. I wanted to ask one question about this Steve who made the request of this case. Have you spoken to that Steve on Facebook after Steve Pankey was arrested?
Well, unfortunately, he has since passed away in another cruel twist of fate. He was actually a poster on an Unsolved Mysteries message board I often frequent. And Steve isn't actually his real name. He just posted under that name on the message board. But after I did the episode, he requested I do it, we connected on Facebook. And sadly, he died of brain cancer, and I think sometime in 2018, which saddens me because he was like really interested in this case, and I think it would have blown him away to see a resolution after all these years, because I think he was worried it was never going to be solved. But that's how I know that they're totally different Steves, because I used to communicate with him on Facebook until his family announced a few years ago that he'd passed away.
That's really sad. Did you know that he had brain cancer?
I don't know when he got it. I don't know if he had it at the time when he originally made the request, but he used to post photos of himself on Facebook talking about his progress with the disease, and unfortunately he was unable to beat it.
Yeah,
too
my
bad.
God. Well, that's tragic. Now, this tweet that you sent out was kind of like an earthquake in the community of what we do, of our peers anyway. I feel like really kind of shook the ground, and I think it's mostly because everybody knows that this happens. That people who are responsible for some of the crimes that we cover, they do listen and they are consuming this stuff. But this is one tangible example, and obviously you're someone we know, someone this has happened to. So I think that's one reason it really resonated with us and our community of peers.
Oh yeah, like we've always suspected something like this. There are probably cases right now that we've covered where we don't know who the perpetrator is, but they could very well be listening. But I think the extra level was the fact that not only did we find out he was listening to the show, but he was pledging me money, which he probably wouldn't have done unless he legitimately liked it. I mean, he had been sending me $10 per month for a year and a half, so I received a total of about $150 in donations from him. So, in retrospect, I'm glad I didn't know who he was at the time, and then I never really said anything about him on any of my episodes, like offered an opinion about his guilt or innocence. But I can only imagine how he was feeling when he was listening to my 2017 episode before he was named as a person of interest. You're wondering, is he kind of feeling, wow, they're talking about what I did and I'm still getting away with it all this time? It's just so creepy to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's probably getting a bit of a thrill out of that, or a major thrill out of that. What was your intent? I'm curious what your intent was in posting that publicly and saying that this man was indicted in the crime. Was it as a cautionary tactic or an informative tactic, or because I'm sure you must have had some inner decision making to decide on whether or not this should be in the public and people should be aware of something like this, or could it just be something where you'd let the police know and let them silently go about looking at people's contributors, donators, patrons?
Well, I kind of debated for a couple days. Do I want to post about this publicly? Because I had found out when he was arrested, I was just kind of shook up. Because for the first several months when he was a person of interest, I wasn't sure what to make of him. because he was doing all these interviews, getting his name out there, and I'm thinking, well, if he was guilty, then maybe he wouldn't be doing this. Maybe he's just legitimately trying to clear his name. And I looked at the arrest warrant, and it seems like it's mostly a circumstantial case against him, that apparently throughout the years he has revealed details about the crime scene which were not public knowledge, and so that's why they think he was personally involved. But I ultimately decided to make the decision to post about it almost as a cautionary thing, to let people know that this does happen sometimes, and here's tangible evidence. And even I was surprised just how much it blew up. I don't think I've sent out a tweet that got more reactions and comments and retweets, but I know people who are like personally involved in a lot of the cases that they feature on their shows, like you guys are with Maura Murray. I don't have any personal interaction in the Jonelle Matthews case. I just thought it was a case I was interested in, but I know other people out there would probably like to know that there is a good possibility that someone who committed a murder in one of the cases you covered is listening.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things I thought when I first saw it was, holy shit, like, I wonder if Robin's okay. Like, how did it make you feel?
Well, I was pretty shook up at first. Just the idea that a murderer, not only was he listening, but he was sending me money. It was just such a weird feeling. But I also knew that there was probably little chance that he was going to come after me or anything, because not only is he behind bars now, but I live in Canada, and the borders are currently closed because of COVID. So, but it always makes you think, how many of these other cases that I've covered are the perpetrators listening, and I don't even know it?
That is a super unsettling thought, because there's so many true crime podcasters, there's so many criminals out there, and there's probably so many of those criminals listening to the true crime podcasts. This is a great example, a great thing that you've done by putting him out there and saying, hey, they actually are listening. Some of them are actually listening, and people should take some measures in watching what they post online personally. Like, if you are a true crime podcaster and one of your family members posts you at some cookout that there's an address visible, you know what I'm saying? Like, someone could very easily look into someone else and find out within a few mile radius where you're located. It's probably not that difficult. So I commend you for putting this out there publicly. I think it was a smart move.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I felt it was wise. And the whole Patreon angle is the fact that I have sent him stuff. So now I know, do not put my return address on there, because I don't want any of them to be potential killers and know where I live when I'm mailing them envelopes.
Right. That's bananas. I mean, you get a P.O. box. True crime podcasters, listen to this. Get a P.O. box in another town, for God's sake. Don't put your return address on stuff. I mean, you never know.
Oh, exactly. And I actually went back and looked at Steve Pankey's contact information, and I actually sent his stuff to a P.O. box in Idaho, because I guess he was kind of a public figure there, because he was a politician who had run for governor. So I guess he tries to keep himself separate. But I was just kind of, when I looked at that, as like, oh my God, do I have this guy's address on file? But that's the importance of P.O. boxes, I guess.
God, yeah, no, this is a great point. Yeah, privacy is very important, and I think in some cases you need to put a return address too. If you're to go into the post office and pay to send it, I think they need a return address. So you can't just, it's not like if you're not dropping something in the mailbox. So yeah, P.O. box is a good call. Pretty frightening.
And it's certainly possible that if I hadn't been going through my list of patrons a couple months ago, I might still not have put two and two together now. I might not have realized that he was still one of my patrons, and I guess he technically still will be, because I don't think he can cancel it from behind bars, so it's probably still going to keep charging his card until it expires, which is another creepy thought.
Oh, that's awesome. I mean, you could just take that money that he's giving to your Patreon and put it towards a nonprofit or something. You could just force the issue and make him do something good without him knowing.
Well, that's actually what I did with the money he had previously sent me. I donated it to private investigations for the missing, which you guys are a part of, and I will continue donating his money to good causes for as long as it comes in.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Tim and I are on the board, and Michelle and Jillian, they're on the board, and that's Bruce Maitland's nonprofit that he started in honor of his daughter, Brianna. So it's hugely appreciated that you did that, and fantastic that it's such poetic justice, really.
Oh, thank you. And I know that the other podcasters I know who he was a patron for, they're doing the same thing. They're continuing to donate all the money they receive from his Patreon to worthy causes.
Well, that's really brilliant way to handle that, and make something really good out of it. So yeah, thank you very much. I commend you for that, and the other podcasters as well. And speaking, with the case of Jonelle, what were some other theories that were interesting in that case that you might have discussed that obviously don't seem as likely now?
Well, they had a very interesting false lead in that case because Jonelle was actually adopted by her parents when she was a baby because her birth mother had only been 13 years old when she gave birth to her in California, so she gave her up for adoption. And then I think it was in 1997, her birth mother finally contacted the Matthews family and said that I would like to reconnect with my daughter if that's okay. And not only was she shocked to discover that her daughter had been abducted 13 years earlier, but the police had actually put her under surveillance for several weeks without her even knowing it, just to see possibly if she found out and decided to kidnap her daughter. But because of privacy laws with adoption, they could not tell her that she was under surveillance. They ultimately cleared her as a suspect and figured out that she couldn't have been involved, but it was just a double shock for her to not only find out that her birth daughter had been abducted, but that the police had looked at her as a suspect and she didn't even know it. But thankfully, she wound up becoming good friends with the Matthews family. They kind of bonded over this whole situation, but it just added to the whole tragedy.
Wow, that is so bizarre.
It's incredible. Has anyone from Jonelle's family reached out to you, or any law enforcement reached out to you just to maybe get some information, like maybe something that they didn't know that he might have told you?
No, not yet, but I'm still kind of anxiously awaiting that. I'm not sure if they will, just because my original episode did not talk about Steve Pankey or anything, so I don't know if there's much information on there, but if they find out he was one of my patrons, they might want to find out if he ever tried to contact me or anything, or sent me any incriminating emails, so time will tell.
What was sorry if I missed this, what was the connecting evidence that led the police to actually arrest him? Because he was a suspect for a while, but what was that connection that brought them to him and actually arrest him?
Well, when they posted the news about his arrest, they actually included the original arrest affidavit, and it sounds like it's just a combination of things. Apparently, they have looked at him as a potential suspect for years, or a person of interest, but they never publicly named him until 2019. But he has apparently revealed stuff about the crime scene that was never revealed publicly, like that someone had used a rake to try to cover up the footprints outside the Matthews residence in the snow. He apparently said that to someone, even though the police never released that information. He's given a lot of contradictory statements. He apparently had said that following Jonelle's disappearance, him and his wife and his son decided to travel to California to spend the Christmas with his family, and he had claimed in interviews that he did not find out about Jonelle's disappearance until after they returned to Greeley. But he has since divorced from his wife, and she is now saying that during the drive back, he was constantly checking the radio to try to find out news about Jonelle's disappearance, even though he's claiming he didn't find out about it until after he arrived. So it's a combination of little things like that where he has said really incriminating statements, and I think they took it to a grand jury and ultimately decided this is strong enough to make an arrest and take him to trial.
Yeah, apparently he said in 2008 at his murdered son's funeral, it says here in the Denver Post that Pankey said there that he hoped God didn't allow this to happen because of Jonelle Matthews, and that's what his ex-wife told authorities.
Yeah, that's a weird side story. I don't know much about his son's murder. I think his son was murdered by his girlfriend in college or something like that. There isn't a lot out there, but yeah, apparently he said that at the funeral and she overheard it, and that's just another weird, creepy sign, which on its own might be not be strong enough evidence, but combined with everything else, it does not look good for him.
Yeah, that's a really weird one.
I guess I want to mention one more other strange detail is that I think in early 1985 they had a church service where Pankey was attending, and the pastor said, "We hope that Jonelle is out there safely somewhere and that she will safely return home." And apparently Pankey had a complete meltdown and caused a scene when he said that, and was asked to leave the church, which some people have taken as a sign that he knew that she was not coming back, and that's why he reacted like this. That's just another small detail when combined with the other all the others looks pretty suspicious.
So in that regard, he was expressing some sort of regret for it?
Possibly, yeah, because that's what people are wondering, like, if he is guilty, like, what the psychology is, why he is continually putting himself out there and doing interviews, and apparently, like, he would, offer to help the police with information, and I think there was one incident where he casually said to them that, "I don't know if you'll find out who abducted Jonelle Matthews unless you offer the responsible party an immunity deal," and does that mean that he was waiting to make a full confession if he knew that he wasn't going to face any legal consequences? I think when he goes to trial and this case comes to a conclusion, it's going to be a really fascinating story just to look over all this guy's behavior over the past 35 years and just try to read into everything he said or did and try to figure out what his motivation was.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I see what you're saying here in this Denver Post article. It says in 1999, he sought out immunity deals in exchange for revealing information he said he had on the killing. So, yeah, he was on their radar for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. And when I recorded my episode in 2017, I had no idea that they had been looking at him. And I know that he had a history of legal problems with the law before this incident. There was an incident in 1977, I think it was, where he was charged with rape. And he always maintained that the sex was consensual and the charges against him were ultimately dropped. But he has said in interviews that the Greeley Police Department has always had a grudge against him since then because they could not make this rape case against him, which is why he's trying to add to the narrative that they're trying to railroad him and frame him. He goes on a lot of long, weird tangents in his interviews, so anyone who wants interest in this case, I highly recommend you seek them out, just because looking at them now at his interviews, you could look at them in an entirely different light now that he has been charged with the murder, and you wonder, is he letting loose something incriminating here that ultimately led to his arrest? It's quite interesting.
Was this rape a same-sex rape?
No, it wasn't. This one was for a woman, but yes, I have heard him say that he thinks that they have tried to go after him because he's gay. What is the term he's used? I think he's used a term that he's kind of a non-practicing homosexual.
A celibate homosexual.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I guess he's implying he's interested in men, but has not had any sexual relationships with them.
So he's just using more and more excuses, blaming law enforcement, just throwing everything at the wall, but ultimately has never taken himself out of talking about the case, which is, yeah, you're right, some really bizarre psychology at work there.
Oh, and also earlier this year, in early 2020, he actually tried to run for local sheriff in Idaho, even though he was publicly named as a person of interest in a murder investigation, which seems incredibly brazen. He didn't wind up winning, of course, not surprisingly, but just the fact that he decided to do so to begin with is just out of this world.
Do you think that he wanted to get caught? Do you think that he wanted this? Going on your Patreon and contributing monthly, he must have had some sort of desire to get the recognition, or maybe even get it off his chest.
That's what I'm thinking. It's certainly a possibility because of the whole immunity deal comment that he made years earlier. It's almost like, I want to confess, I want people to know I did this, but I don't want to serve time in prison for it. It's almost like, because they're probably not going to offer you an immunity deal just because you confess to a murder, so I don't know what his thinking was with that.
Yeah, and he didn't even really say it was a confession. He just said, information. It seems like, so really kind of stringing them along, and so they probably weren't looking at him until he inserted himself. That's just my speculation, but
do you think it's common for somebody to have their first crime that they commit be the abduction and murder of a 12-year-old girl? Is that common? Or do you sense that there might be something that he had tried beforehand, maybe some attempted abductions?
That's what I'm wondering. I'm really interested to find out his backstory before this, because he would have been in his mid-30s when this took place, and it just seems really, really calculated. And we're still not entirely sure of his motive, because since Jonelle was found, she was skeletal remains when she was found. They've never been able to determine if she was sexually assaulted, and they didn't release this until after his arrest, but her exact cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. And he apparently owned a firearm during that time period. So I don't know if this was his first attempt to try it, but if he did, he got incredibly lucky that he managed to do it at a point when she was home alone by herself on a school night, and managed to get away from the scene before her family got home.
Any interest in speaking with him if that opportunity ever arises?
I don't know, like, I've heard some interviews with him, and he tends to go off on some long tangents a lot of the time. Like, he'll change the subject and just drone on and on and on. So it's tough to know, like, if you will get any truth from him if you try to do an interview.
Wow. God, fascinating.
So, Robin, what else is coming up on your show? What episodes do you have in the works?
Well, I'm going to be releasing a episode about Patrice Endres, which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries back in July. It's going to be coming out in early November, and I'm currently working on one from 1977 about the disappearance of a woman named Melanie Flynn, which is embroiled in what's often been referred to as the Bluegrass Conspiracy, since there was a major drug trafficking operation in the late 70s, early 80s involving corrupt former police officers, and she had allegedly been working as an undercover informant and may have been romantically involved in one of the corrupt police officers who was running drugs. So there's been speculation that she was eliminated because she knew too much, but to this day they have still not found her remains. And her father was actually a former Kentucky state senator, and her brother was a baseball player with the Cincinnati Reds during that time period, so he was semi-famous. So her family has done a lot to keep this case in the spotlight these past 4 decades, but it's still unsolved to this day.
Wow, look forward to hearing that.
According to your website, you have somewhere along the lines of 197 episodes. Is that pretty accurate? Is that up to date?
It's even more than that, because during the early days of my podcast, I alternated between longer feature-length episodes and minisodes, but I stopped doing the minisodes about 3 years ago. So in addition to that 197 episodes, we have 32 minisodes, so the actual total would be around 230 cases covered.
Okay. That's 230 cases that you've covered. Was there any time in this long career of podcasting and covering cases, was there any case that made you just want to stop, or anything that was happening externally of that case that made you want to stop, or any of the cases?
Not really. I'm kind of lucky in the sense that I will just do one case, then move on to the next one. But I really like doing this. I like researching and writing and putting together these episodes. And the Steve Pankey thing is probably the thing that has shook me up the most since I started doing it, because that's the first time I learned that an actual accused murderer in one of my cases was listening to my episodes. But thus far, I've been pretty lucky in terms of harassment or anything like that, so I'll continue to do it as long as I can.
Good.
And we promise we won't tell your current daytime employer how much time you've spent with us today, or how much time you just spend in general on true crime, because you should keep your day job too as well, just to be safe. You never know.
Oh, exactly, yes. I'd love to be a full-time podcaster, but I don't know how feasible it is at this point. But I'm happy to do both if I still can. Great.
And I got to ask you about the episode on Netflix about Jack Wheeler. I watched that one recently. It's volume 2 of Netflix's recent release, The Washington Insider Murder. I was really into that one.
I'm inclined to think that it was just a sad mental breakdown. I don't think he was murdered. I had heard of the case in the news before, when he was originally found dead about 10 years ago, and they kept calling it a murder or homicide, so I figured it was a conspiracy of some sort. But after watching the episode and just tracking his full movements, I get the impression that he just had a mental break and probably died after lying down in the dumpster, either from exposure or because he was crushed when the garbage garbage truck picked up the dumpster, and I think they were just lucky that they managed to find his body in the landfill. But it's a really interesting story, but I ultimately think it's more of a sad tragedy than an actual murder.
Do you have a particular way you go about researching your cases, or even finding the cases, and deciding which one's going to be next, other than the Unsolved Mysteries connection?
Well, I often get requests from listeners a lot of the time. That's how I found out about the Jonelle Matthews murder, just because this other guy, Steve W., had requested it to me. So it's kind of an interesting mix where I do Unsolved Mysteries cases. Sometimes I'll do listener requests, and then sometimes I'll find like an interesting case on Reddit, which I had never heard of before, but I just think sounds so interesting and would be the subject of such a cool episode that I just decide to do it, even though I had never heard of it before. I kind of schedule my cases based on how much time I have to put together an episode. If it's a case I'm familiar with from Unsolved Mysteries for years, then and I know I can do it relatively quickly, I'll do it when I'm short on time. But if it's one that's a major deep rabbit hole that requires tons of research, I kind of put it on the back burner and schedule it for a later date.
That's fair. And my final question here, Robin, is about Maura Murray. You've covered all these cases, unsolved cases, missing persons cases. What are your thoughts on the disappearance of Maura Murray?
I honestly have no idea. I mean, that one I've just gone so back and forth on. I mean, when I first heard about it many years ago, I almost went with the simplest explanation that she just suffered a mental breakdown, wandered off into the woods, and died of exposure. But then I think to myself, there's no way this case would have become so complicated if it had such a simple explanation. And I know you guys have dug up so much about this case that I still wonder to myself, is there more to it than meets the eye? I know, isn't one of the fringe theories that she escaped to Quebec to start a new life?
Yeah, I mean, you could, that's one of the fringe theories. Yeah, that's one of the theories.
Well, I know that I live on the border of Quebec here in Ottawa right now, so when I sometimes have it in the back of my mind, I wonder if I'll bump into her on the streets of Ottawa or something if she is still alive, but I don't know if that's likely.
Well, I personally hope you do bump into her. I want to follow up Tim's Maura Murray question with a Brianna Maitland question. Have you followed Brianna Maitland's disappearance?
Not for a couple years. It was on Disappeared, right? The TV show?
Yep.
Yeah, I remember originally watching it on there, but I haven't really delved into it for a couple years. But I do know that I get requests to cover it on The Trail Went Cold from time to time, so maybe one of these days I will put together my own episode.
Let us know if you do, and if you need any resources, we're totally here for you. The more attention that her case can get, the better.
Okay, definitely. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Robin, for joining us here. We really appreciate your time and your work.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Well done, putting that guy out there, Stephen Pankey, putting him out there and, just making everybody aware of the reality of the situation. You're talking about real crimes, real criminals, real victims, and it can be real life very quickly. Tim, it's an exciting day. It's an exciting time here. It is time, Tim, for the big reveal. The first crime riddle of the week revealed right now.
I'm excited. In case you haven't listened to last week's episode, Lance and I officially launched a riddle challenge for all of our listeners. For 4 weeks, we read out a riddle each week about a famous true crime murder case in history. Everyone can join in the challenge. Just head over to crimeriddle.com to officially register, and you'll even receive clues and hints via email in case you need them.
You'll have to listen to the riddle on the podcast each week or find the audiogram available in the official challenge website that Tim just mentioned or on our Instagram/Twitter accounts at Crawlspace. We will be picking 3 lucky winners who solve all 4 riddles, and they'll have the chance to win free access to our true crime audio course along with a special mystery box gift prize.
What's in the box, Lance? What's in the box?
Stay back, California. That we can't reveal. But for now, what we can reveal is the answer to last week's riddle and this week's riddle to be solved. You all ready for this? Tim, I'm so excited to be the one to announce the answer to last week's riddle. I can't believe that.
Actually, though, mine is a missing persons case and not a murder, so it couldn't be that case. Shit. What do you think it is?
Like I've said, I'm so excited.
Me too. All right, well, what are we waiting for? Can you give the answer now?
I've been saying how excited I am to give the answer to last week's riddle. It is the Black Dahlia.
Okay. I thought so. No, I didn't. But let's explain how. And so let's dissect this riddle real quick. So the riddle is, ahead, I have only one.
I have only one.
Right. Dahlia flowers only have one flower head per stem. How clever.
Picked in the dark.
And when you pick flowers, you essentially cut them off. Elizabeth Short's body was found cut in half, as everyone knows. She was the Black Dahlia.
A time sought to be fun.
She was on a night out when people last saw her.
In Overtone, I was planted.
Overtone is an anagram for Norton Ave,
Wow.
which was where her body was planted. She wasn't killed there, as investigators know, but she was planted there on the corner of Norton Ave in Los Angeles.
In hopes of midsummer to first frost.
Lance, everyone knows dahlia flowers bloom from midsummer to first frost, and they don't survive in winter.
Everyone knows that. This I was not granted.
Elizabeth was killed sometime between January 9th and January 15th during the winter.
Dreams of light lost.
Of course, Elizabeth was a Hollywood hopeful. She was an actress hoping to catch her big break, and astute Crawlspace fans might remember that my grandmother lived with Elizabeth Short at one point in Medford, Massachusetts.
She sure did, and from what I heard, she always left the cap off the milk. If you got last week's riddle right, congratulations. You still have the chance to win the grand prize. If not, don't stress. Life's too stressful as it is. You still get 3 more riddles to solve. If you guess at least 2 of these riddles right, 2 of you will still get free access to our True Crime Podcaster audio course, which will be determined through random drawings.
All right, let's get into this week's riddle.
Well, in the words of Rocky Balboa, go for it.
Okay, listen carefully. Bells were silenced. Cheers ran cold. Red was the vino. Tight was its hold. Held too long. Sighs summers too short. Beautiful was the crown, but cruel was the court.
Well, that one's a doozy, Tim. I got to tell you, I'm completely baffled.
Oh, I know it. It's a real easy one for me.
All right, well, anyone else out there, remember to officially join the challenge. You only have to sign on once to www.crimeriddle.com. If you signed on last week, no need to sign up again. Be sure to check your email if you want clues or hints. Do check our posts on Instagram for any hidden clues on there as well. Be sure to submit your final answers for this week's riddle before the next episode goes live. Head on over to www.crimeriddle.com to submit your answer under the Solve the Case header and put your answer on the box along with your email address.
Keep in mind that you only have one shot to answer the riddle per week. Only your first submission will be considered, so think carefully. If you want to check out our True Crime audio course, you can find a link to more details on crimeriddle.com at the bottom, or simply go to avid.fm/truecrime. Again, that's avid.fm/truecrime. The audio course is now out for pre-orders. The first 50 students can pre-order and get 50% off using the code Crawlspace. Again, that's code Crawlspace, and get 50% off the course. We've also got a standard early bird discount of 20% that will be automatically applied as soon as you pre-order, so head on over to avid.fm/truecrime.